In this robust story, we follow the journey of a determined mother, Victoria Taylor, who fights against prejudice and injustice to protect her daughter Elena at an elite school. What starts as a painful tale of exclusion transforms into an inspiring account of courage, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. This story is a reminder that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged when people speak out and demand change. Before we dive into this gripping tale of resilience and advocacy, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this inspiring and heartfelt story, don't forget to subscribe. The towering gates of Crestview Academy shimmered under the warm morning sun. Their intricate iron designs and polished finish were symbols of the institution's exclusivity. Crestview was not just a school, it was a revered academic haven, a beacon of prestige known for shaping the brightest minds from the wealthiest families. Nestled amidst sprawling acres of manicured lawns, gardens, and state-of-the-art facilities, the school resembled an elite university campus more than a middle school. The stately red brick buildings with ivy creeping up their walls housed laboratories, lecture halls, and classrooms, with massive windows overlooking pristine sports fields. Every corner of Crestview whispered of success and opportunities that most children could only dream of. For most students, Crestview symbolized the apex of privilege. They arrived in chauffeured cars, dressed in designer clothing, their lives already adorned with paths paved by influence and affluence. The institution promised to prepare them for the best universities and careers the world could offer, demanding excellence in return. But for Elena Taylor, Crestview was a place of daunting uncertainty. A quiet and perceptive 13-year-old, Elena was new to this world of privilege. She had grown up watching her mother, Victoria Taylor, a prominent black entrepreneur, build her business empire through determination, hard work, and unshakable resilience. Victoria wasn't just successful, she was a force of nature. Her story of rising from humble beginnings to becoming a leader in the philanthropic and business community inspired admiration. Victoria was known for breaking barriers and opening doors for others, and her poise commanded respect wherever she went. Elena idolized her mother, both for her strength and the unwavering love she provided. When the opportunity to attend Crestview came, Victoria did not hesitate. She wanted her daughter to have access to the best education and opportunities, ensuring that Elena would never face the challenges she had endured. For Elena, the thought of attending Crestview filled her with both excitement and apprehension. She wanted to make her mother proud, to prove herself worthy of the sacrifices Victoria had made. However, as Elena walked through the gleaming hallways of Crestview on her first day, her optimism began to waver. The walls were adorned with plaques, awards, and photographs of alumni who had gone on to become world leaders and CEOs. Yet as she passed groups of her new classmates, she noticed something unsettling. The whispers, the glances exchanged behind her back, and the way people's eyes flickered over her uniform as though it were slightly out of place. Her first impression of Crestview was one of division. Though the uniforms were technically identical, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that hers stood out in a way that marked her as different. The other students wore theirs effortlessly, as if they were just another accessory to their privilege. Their laughter and confident chatter echoed through the hallways, while Elena kept her gaze lowered, clutching her books tightly against her chest. Then came her first class with Mr. Thompson. Known as one of the toughest and most disciplined teachers at Crestview, Mr. Thompson had a reputation for being strict to the point of intimidation. Tall and sharply dressed in tailored suits, his presence was commanding, his gaze sharp and assessing. Many students respected him, but few dared to cross him. When Elena entered his classroom for the first time, her heart raced as she introduced herself. "My name is Elena Taylor. I'm new to the school this year," she said with a polite smile. Mr. Thompson barely glanced at her, offering only a curt nod before moving on to the next student. His indifference stung, but Elena told herself that it was just his way, and perhaps he was equally cold to all new students. As the days passed, however, a pattern emerged. During lessons, when Elena raised her hand to answer questions or contribute to discussions, Mr. Thompson would glance past her as though she were invisible. The moments felt endless, her arm aching from holding it up, only to watch another student like Rachel Carter, a confident and polished blonde girl from a prominent family, be called on almost immediately. Rachel's answers were met with smiles and encouragement, while Elena's rare contributions were dismissed with a brief, or a barely concealed impatience. It didn't take long for Elena to notice that her classmates were beginning to mirror Mr. Thompson's behavior. Elena wasn't just ignored, she was excluded. During lunch breaks, she sat alone at a table, quietly eating her packed lunch, while groups of students chatted and laughed together around her. On one occasion, she gathered enough courage to approach a group of girls talking about a science project. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. The girls offered polite but clearly dismissive smiles, making no effort to include her in the conversation. After a few minutes of standing awkwardly, Elena mumbled an excuse and walked away. By the end of her first week, the isolation weighed heavily on her. Crestview, with all its prestige and promise, began to feel like an alien world, a world that didn't want her in it. Despite her mother's reassurances that she belonged anywhere she chose to be, Elena couldn't help but wonder if this place was an exception. Though she tried her best to keep a brave face, the truth was that she felt invisible, like a shadow moving through the hallways of a school that celebrated brightness. She didn't tell Victoria about her struggles, unwilling to worry her mother or seem ungrateful for the opportunity she had been given. "I'll figure it out," she thought to herself. "I just need more time." But deep down, Elena wasn't sure time was enough to bridge the gap between her world and the one Crestview students seemed to inhabit effortlessly. And the looming presence of Mr. Thompson only made the divide feel wider. Little did she know, her quiet battle was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation, one that would change everything. Elena walked to her next class with her books clutched tightly against her chest. The chatter of her classmates filled the hallways, their voices blending into a low hum. She felt like an outsider watching a world she didn't quite belong to, a world where conversations flowed effortlessly, and people exchanged confident smiles. Despite her best efforts, her first week at Crestview Academy had only amplified her doubts. Every interaction, or lack thereof, seemed to reinforce the idea that she didn't fit in. In the classroom, Mr. Thompson's behavior had begun to cross a line from cold indifference to pointed dismissal. During a literature discussion, Elena had raised her hand, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She'd spent the previous evening carefully analyzing the text, hoping that this would be her chance to make an impression. When Mr. Thompson's eyes swept over her, pausing just briefly, she thought he might finally call on her. But he turned away, addressing another student instead. "Excellent point, Rachel," he said, nodding approvingly as the confident blonde girl delivered her answer. Elena slowly lowered her hand, heat rising to her cheeks as she tried to mask her disappointment. It wasn't just her. Elena had noticed that Mr. Thompson had reserved his encouragement and patience for a select few students whose families wielded influence or carried the weight of Crestview's legacy. Rachel Carter, for example, was the daughter of a prominent businessman whose name adorned one of the school's buildings. Meanwhile, Elena's attempts to contribute were met with curt dismissals or passive-aggressive remarks. On one occasion, she'd answered a question about a Shakespearean sonnet with an analysis she was proud of. "That's an interesting perspective, Elena," Mr. Thompson had said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But let's hear from someone with a bit more experience in critical thinking." The quiet laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through Elena's resolve. She bit her lip and looked down at her notebook, her vision blurring as she scribbled mindlessly to distract herself. The cafeteria wasn't any better. Elena had grown used to sitting alone during lunch, pretending to be engrossed in her phone or a book while the other students gathered in clusters around her. Once, she had tried joining a group conversation about a school trip to the Science Museum. "That's a great place," Elena had said, smiling hesitantly. "I visited it once with my mom. The space exhibit is incredible." Rachel glanced at her briefly before turning back to the others. "Anyway," she said, continuing the conversation as if Elena hadn't spoken. Elena felt the sting of rejection but tried to brush it off. "Maybe they're just not used to me yet," she told herself. But the loneliness gnawed at her, and with each passing day, it became harder to keep the sadness from showing. Things took a darker turn during a science class with Mr. Thompson. It was a lesson on chemical reactions, and the students were tasked with mixing solutions under his supervision. They worked in pairs, measuring liquids and observing the reactions in beakers. When it was Elena's turn, Mr. Thompson handed her a beaker filled with a clear liquid. "Be careful with this," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "I wouldn't want you to mess it up." Elena's hands trembled as she held the beaker, conscious of her classmates' eyes on her. Slowly, she began to pour the liquid into the flask, her movements careful and precise. "Steady now," Mr. Thompson said, louder this time. His words were laced with sarcasm, and a few students stifled giggles. Elena felt a lump form in her throat as she focused on her task, but her nerves betrayed her, and a small splash of liquid spilled over the edge of the flask onto the table. "Exactly what I was worried about," Mr. Thompson announced to the class, his voice carrying a smug tone. "This is why attention to detail is so important. Some people simply aren't cut out for this kind of work." The room filled with quiet laughter, and Elena's face burned with humiliation. She quickly grabbed a cloth to clean the spill, her hands shaking as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "Don't forget to wipe thoroughly," Mr. Thompson added, his smirk making it clear he was enjoying her discomfort. Elena wanted to disappear. She felt the weight of every stare, every whisper, pressing down on her as she finished the task in silence. When the bell finally rang, she rushed out of the classroom, her cheeks still flushed and her heart heavy. That evening, Elena sat across from her mother at the dinner table, picking at her food. Victoria noticed the slump in her daughter's shoulders, the dark circles under her eyes, and the absence of her usual sparkle. "Elena, sweetheart," Victoria said gently, reaching out to touch her hand. "Is everything okay?" Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to burden her mother or seem ungrateful. But as she met Victoria's warm, understanding gaze, the weight of her experiences became too much to bear. "I don't think I belong at Crestview," she whispered, her voice cracking. Victoria's brows furrowed with concern. "What do you mean, honey? Why would you say that?" Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she recounted the events of the past week. The subtle exclusions, the cold shoulders from classmates, and Mr. Thompson's deliberate attempts to humiliate her. She tried to keep her voice steady, but the pain she'd been holding back spilled out in raw, trembling words. Victoria listened silently, her grip on Elena's hand tightening as anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. Her daughter's pain cut through her like a knife, and a fierce protectiveness rose within her. "Elena," Victoria said firmly, her voice low but resolute, "no one has the right to make you feel this way. You are brilliant, kind, and capable, and I won't let anyone make you doubt that." Elena wiped her tears, her voice barely audible. "But Mom, he makes me feel so small, like I don't belong there." Victoria's eyes blazed with determination. "Then we're going to show him just how wrong he is. That man picked the wrong family to mess with." Elena looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "What are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes," Victoria said, her voice steady and unyielding. "I'll make sure he understands that no one treats my daughter this way." That night, Victoria sat alone in her study, her mind racing with anger and determination. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the papers scattered across the desk work she had intended to finish that evening, but her focus was elsewhere. The image of Elena's tear-streaked face and trembling voice replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. Victoria Taylor was not the kind of woman who backed down from a challenge. She had spent her life breaking barriers and proving herself in spaces where she wasn't initially welcome. Crestview was no different. This was supposed to be a place of opportunity for her daughter, a stepping stone toward a brighter future. Instead, it had become a source of pain. Picking up her phone, Victoria dialed a number she knew by heart. Laura Green, a close friend and renowned civil rights attorney, was someone she could always rely on for advice. The phone rang twice before Laura's familiar, confident voice came through the line. "Victoria, what's going on?" Laura asked, sensing the urgency in her friend's tone. Victoria explained everything's struggles, the humiliations in Mr. Thompson's class, and the isolation she had endured. As she spoke, her voice was steady but laced with barely restrained anger. Laura listened quietly, her tone calm but purposeful when she finally responded. "That teacher doesn't just have a bias," Laura said firmly. "He's intentionally targeting her. We need to take this seriously. Do you want to approach this legally right away, or start by addressing it through the school administration?" "I want to see how the school handles it first," Victoria replied. "But I'm not afraid to escalate if they don't take it seriously." "Smart," Laura agreed. "You'll need to gather evidence, everything from specific incidents to corroborating testimonies. If there are other parents who've noticed similar behavior, you should reach out to them." Victoria nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. "Thank you, Laura. I'll call you once I have more information." After hanging up, Victoria opened her laptop and began researching Crestview's policies on teacher conduct and discrimination. She read through pages of the school's handbook, noting every clause that emphasized their commitment to fostering an inclusive environment. If Crestview prided itself on integrity, it was time to hold them accountable to their own standards. The next day, Victoria began reaching out to other parents whose children were in Mr. Thompson's class. She started with families she had met briefly during school events, carefully framing her questions to gauge their experiences. To her dismay, she discovered that Elena wasn't the only one who had suffered under Mr. Thompson's watch. One parent, Marcus Evans, shared how his son, a talented artist, had been belittled for pursuing creative interests instead of excelling in science, something Mr. Thompson seemed to look down on. Another mother, Maria Sanchez, tearfully recounted how her daughter, a quiet but brilliant student, had been ignored during class discussions while more outspoken students received praise. Maria's voice trembled as she spoke. "I thought it was just my daughter, but now that you've brought this up, I realize it's a pattern. He picks on kids who don't fit his idea of worthy." Victoria listened intently, her resolve hardening with each story. She assured the parents that they were not alone and invited them to a meeting at her house to discuss a collective course of action. By the end of the day, Victoria had contacted several families who had experienced similar issues. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation or jeopardizing their children's future at Crestview. However, others, particularly those who had witnessed Mr. Thompson's dismissive attitude firsthand, were eager to stand with her. That evening, Victoria welcomed a small but determined group of parents into her living room. The atmosphere was heavy, with a mix of frustration and hope. As they settled into their seats, Victoria stood at the front of the room, her poise and confidence commanding their attention. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but impassioned. "I know this isn't an easy conversation to have, but we owe it to our children to ensure they feel safe, valued, and respected in their education." Laura was also present, standing beside Victoria with a notepad in hand. She introduced herself briefly before explaining their plan. "The first step is to gather written statements from each of you about the incidents you've witnessed or your children have experienced. These statements will form the basis of a formal complaint to the school administration. If they refuse to act, we'll escalate this to the school board, the media, or even the courts if necessary." The parents nodded, some exchanging murmurs of agreement. Marcus spoke up, his tone cautious. "Do you think the school will actually listen to us? Mr. Thompson's been there for years. He's respected." Victoria met his gaze, her voice resolute. "Respected or not, no one is above accountability. If enough of us come forward, they'll have no choice but to take this seriously." Maria added, her voice gaining strength. "It's about time someone stood up to him. My daughter deserves better." They all do. For the next 2 hours, the group discussed their experiences, venting frustrations while strategizing their approach. Laura took meticulous notes, advising them on how to frame their statements to emphasize the patterns of discrimination and unprofessionalism. By the end of the meeting, Victoria felt a sense of solidarity forming among the parents. They were no longer individuals fighting isolated battles. They were a united front determined to create change. As the parents left, one by one, Victoria stood at the door, thanking them for their courage. When the last family had gone, Laura turned to her with a small smile. "You're building something powerful here, Victoria. They won't be able to ignore this." Victoria nodded, her resolve unshaken. I'm not doing this just for Elena. This is for every child who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. The following morning, Victoria called the school and requested a meeting with the headmaster and the administration. When the receptionist tried to defer her to another staff member, Victoria's tone turned firm. I'm a major donor to this institution, and I won't be dismissed. I expect a response by the end of the day. Her phone rang that afternoon. Mr. Whitman, the headmaster, agreed to meet with her later that week. As she hung up, Victoria felt a surge of determination. This was the first step, but she knew the road ahead would be long. Later that evening, she sat with Elena at the dinner table. For the first time in days, she saw a faint smile on her daughter's face. I talked to some of the other parents, Victoria said gently. We're going to make sure this gets resolved. Elena looked up, her eyes wide with gratitude. Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you. Victoria reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You don't have to fight this alone, Elena. I've got you. The day of the meeting arrived with tension that filled the crisp autumn air. Victoria dressed deliberately, choosing a sleek navy blue suit that radiated authority. She pulled her hair into a sharp bun and stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting her blazer. Today wasn't just about her daughter. It was about confronting an entire institution that had failed her child. Elena, I'll be back soon, she said softly as she picked up her briefcase. Don't worry, we're going to handle this. Elena sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting with her notebook. Do you think they'll listen? She asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Victoria leaned down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and smiled reassuringly. They will, and if they don't, we'll make them. As Victoria arrived at Crestview Academy, the school grounds were bustling with activity. Students walked briskly to their next classes, while teachers exchanged quick conversations in the hallways. The grandeur of the campus, which once inspired awe in Victoria, now felt like an unwelcoming fortress she was about to breach. The receptionist greeted her with a polite but reserved smile. Miss Taylor, the headmaster is expecting you. Right this way. Victoria followed the young woman down a long corridor, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. She was ushered into a conference room filled with leather chairs and a long mahogany table. Seated at the far end was Mr. Whitman, the headmaster, a distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and a crisp gray suit. His demeanor was calm, but his sharp eyes revealed a mix of curiosity and caution. Beside him sat Miss Hanover, the school's public relations director, and Dr. Nelson, the academic coordinator. Miss Taylor, Mr. Whitman said, rising to shake her hand. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Victoria nodded politely, but kept her expression neutral. She placed her briefcase on the table and sat down, her posture straight and commanding. I appreciate you meeting with me, she began, her tone measured but firm. Unfortunately, the circumstances that bring me here are far from ideal. I'm here to discuss the mistreatment of my daughter Elena by Mr. Thompson. Mr. Whitman exchanged a brief glance with Miss Hanover before responding. I'm sorry to hear about your concerns. Mr. Thompson is one of our most experienced educators, and he has a long-standing reputation at Crestview. What exactly seems to be the issue? Victoria opened her briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized folder. The issue is that Mr. Thompson has been consistently targeting my daughter in ways that are both unprofessional and damaging to her confidence. I have documented instances of him ignoring her in class, belittling her contributions, and creating an environment where she feels unwelcome. She slid the folder across the table, and Dr. Nelson picked it up, flipping through the pages. These are written statements from other parents whose children have experienced similar treatment, Victoria continued. This isn't an isolated incident. There's a pattern of behavior here that cannot be ignored. Miss Hanover cleared her throat. Miss Taylor, while we take all concerns seriously, I think it's important to remember that Mr. Thompson has been with us for over 2 decades. He's highly regarded by many families and has always maintained high academic standards. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Maintaining high standards does not excuse mistreatment or discrimination. If anything, it makes it worse. My daughter deserves to be treated with respect, as do all students at this school. It's unacceptable for anyone alone, the teacher, to undermine her confidence and make her feel as though she doesn't belong. Mr. Whitman leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. Miss Taylor, these are serious allegations. We'll need time to review the statements and conduct a thorough investigation. I assure you we'll handle this matter with the utmost care. I appreciate that, Victoria replied, her tone calm but unwavering. However, I want to be clear. If no concrete action is taken, I will escalate this matter to the school board, and if necessary, the media. Crestview prides itself on its reputation for excellence, but allowing this kind of behavior to persist undermines everything the school claims to stand for. There was a moment of silence as her words hung in the air. Mr. Whitman's expression tightened slightly, and Miss Hanover scribbled notes on a pad in front of her. Dr. Nelson spoke next, his tone measured. Miss Taylor, we will take your concerns seriously. We also ask for your patience as we work through this. These matters take time, and we want to ensure a fair and balanced investigation. Victoria nodded, though she wasn't entirely satisfied. Time is fine, but I'll remind you that Elena and other students continue to suffer while this behavior goes unchecked. I will not allow this to be swept under the rug. Mr. Whitman folded his hands on the table. Of course. We'll be in touch soon with updates on the investigation. Victoria stood, shaking his hand firmly before gathering her things. Thank you for your time. I trust you'll do the right thing. As she walked out of the conference room, Victoria felt a mix of emotions. She was proud to stand her ground but frustrated at the lack of immediate action. She knew this was just the first battle in what could be a prolonged fight. Back at home, she filled Elena in on the details of the meeting. Her daughter listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. So, what happens now? Elena asked hesitantly. Victoria knelt beside her, looking into her eyes. Now we wait for their response, but that doesn't mean we stop. I'll keep working with the other parents and gathering support. No matter how long it takes, I'll make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve. Elena nodded, her lips curving into a small but hopeful smile. Thank you, Mom. Victoria smiled back, pulling her into a hug. Always, sweetheart, always. Over the next few days, Victoria continued coordinating with the other parents. She and Laura refined their strategy, preparing for the possibility that the school's investigation might not yield the results they hoped for. They compiled additional statements, researched Crestview's policies, and even began drafting press releases, just in case. Victoria was determined not to let the school's bureaucracy delay justice. If they wanted to drag their feet, she would ensure they felt the pressure of public scrutiny. And as the days stretched on, Elena began to feel a flicker of hope. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Victoria's determination grew sharper with every passing day. While Crestview's administration took its time deliberating, she focused on building a coalition of parents who shared her concerns. It wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about ensuring no other child felt the sting of exclusion or the weight of humiliation from those who were supposed to support them. The following weekend, Victoria hosted a meeting at her home. Families trickled in one by one, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet frustration. Victoria greeted each parent warmly, guiding them to the living room, where seats were arranged in a semicircle. She had asked Laura Green, her trusted attorney, to facilitate the meeting. Laura's presence added a sense of professionalism and authority to the gathering, which Victoria knew was essential for convincing hesitant parents to join the cause. As everyone settled into their seats, Victoria stood at the center of the room, her gaze moving from face to face. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but impassioned. "I know this isn't an easy subject to discuss, but it's one we can no longer ignore. What's happening at Crestview isn't just affecting my daughter, it's affecting many of your children too, and it's time we address it together." There were murmurs of agreement, and a few parents nodded silently. "Before we begin," Victoria continued, gesturing to Laura, "I'd like to introduce Laura Green, a civil rights attorney who has been helping me navigate this situation. She's here to ensure we have a clear path forward." Laura stood and offered a confident smile. "Thank you, Victoria, and thank you all for being here." I know how difficult it can be to speak out, especially when it comes to your children. But change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people like us stand together and demand accountability. Victoria resumed her place, and the floor was open for discussion. The first to speak was Marcus Evans, a father whose son David had been quietly struggling in Mr. Thompson's class. "My son comes home every day feeling like he doesn't measure up," Marcus said, his voice heavy with frustration. "David's a great kid, smart and curious, but Mr. Thompson treats him like he's invisible. I've heard him say things like, 'Stick to what you're good at,' when David tries to participate in science labs. It's demoralizing." Maria Sanchez, who had spoken to Victoria earlier, shared her story next. "My daughter Sophia is a straight-A student, but she feels like she's constantly overlooked in class discussions. It's as if Mr. Thompson has already decided who deserves his attention, and it's never her." The stories poured out, each one adding weight to the growing pile of grievances against Mr. Thompson. Some parents had specific incidents to share, while others described the overall atmosphere of exclusion their children faced. One mother, Jasmine Lee, hesitated before speaking. "I wasn't sure about coming tonight," she admitted. "But hearing all of you, it's clear that this isn't just a series of misunderstandings. My son Ethan stopped raising his hand in class altogether. He says it's easier to stay quiet than to deal with the way Mr. Thompson talks down to him." Victoria listened intently, her resolve hardening with each story. When everyone had finished speaking, she stood again, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "What's happening to our children isn't just unfair, it's unacceptable. We've entrusted this school with their education, their confidence, and their well-being. And they've let us down." Laura stepped in, her tone calm but authoritative. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we'll collect written statements from all of you, detailing your children's experiences. These statements will become the foundation of a formal complaint to the school. Second, we'll demand a review of Mr. Thompson's conduct and an immediate response from Crestview. If the school fails to act, we'll escalate to the board, to the media, and, if necessary, to the courts." There was a pause as the parents absorbed the plan. "But what if they retaliate?" Jasmine asked, her voice tinged with worry. "What if our kids suffer because of this?" Victoria's gaze softened, and she addressed the group directly. "I won't let that happen. This isn't about tearing the school down. It's about holding them to the standards they claim to uphold. And if we stand together, they'll know we're serious. They can't silence all of us." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Slowly but surely, the energy shifted from hesitation to resolve. By the end of the meeting, the parents had signed a collective agreement to move forward. They exchanged phone numbers and emails, creating a network of support to ensure no one felt alone in the fight. Laura stayed behind to finalize the details with Victoria. As the last parent left, she turned to her friend with a small smile. "You've got them on board. That's the hardest part." Victoria nodded, her determination unwavering. "This isn't just for Elena. It's for every child who's ever been made to feel small." The following week, Victoria submitted the formal complaint to the administration, supported by nearly 24 written statements from parents. Each document detailed instances of bias, exclusion, and humiliation, painting a clear picture of the toxic environment Mr. Thompson had cultivated. Crestview's response was polite but guarded. A meeting with the school board was scheduled, and Victoria was told the complaint would be reviewed thoroughly. But Victoria wasn't naive. She knew institutions like Crestview often prioritize their reputation over real change. Determined to keep the pressure on, she began preparing for the next steps. Laura helped her draft press releases and gathered media contacts, ensuring they had everything in place if the school failed to act. At the same time, Victoria maintained open communication with the parents, updating them regularly on the progress of their complaints. The solidarity they had built during the meeting only grew stronger, with families supporting one another through shared stories and words of encouragement. Meanwhile, Elena noticed the changes at home. For the first time since joining Crestview, she felt a sense of hope. Seeing her mother and other parents fight back gave her a courage she hadn't known she had. During lunch one day, she overheard a few classmates whispering about the growing tension between the parents and the administration. "Do you think Mr. Thompson's in trouble?" one student asked. "I heard my mom talking about it," another replied. "She said a bunch of parents are mad at him. I mean, he's kind of mean sometimes." Elena felt a flicker of satisfaction. The tides were beginning to turn. At home, Victoria reassured her daughter every step of the way. "This isn't just about holding one person accountable," she said. "It's about making sure you and every student know they belong." The day of the school board meeting arrived with an air of anticipation. Word had spread through the Crestview community about the formal complaint filed against Mr. Thompson. Some parents whispered their support in private, while others expressed doubt, claiming his decades-long tenure at the school spoke louder than the accusations. Victoria Taylor, however, was undeterred. She had prepared meticulously for this moment. Dressed in a tailored black suit that exuded authority, she carried a folder containing every written statement, legal clause, and supporting document Laura had helped her compile. This was more than just a meeting. It was a reckoning. The boardroom was intimidating, with its long, polished tables surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Framed portraits of past headmasters lined the walls, each figure staring down as if silently upholding Crestview's traditions. Seated at the table were the 7 members of the school board, along with Mr. Whitman, the headmaster, and Miss Hanover, the PR director. As Victoria entered, accompanied by Laura and a small group of parents, conversations ceased. The room filled with a heavy, expectant silence. "Good afternoon," Mr. Whitman said, rising to greet her. "Thank you for taking the time to join us today." Victoria returned his handshake firmly, but without warmth. "Thank you for having us. I trust we all understand the importance of today's discussion." They took their seats, and the chairman of the board, Mr. Carter, a tall man with a stern expression, cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the initial complaint and statements provided by you and other parents. This is a serious matter, and we're here to determine the appropriate course of action." Victoria nodded, her hands steady as she opened her folder. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Before we proceed, I'd like to reiterate that this is not just about my daughter Elena, but about a broader pattern of behavior that has no place at Crestview." "Miss Taylor," interrupted Miss Radcliffe, another board member, with a sharp tone. "While we appreciate your concerns, Mr. Thompson has been with us for over 20 years. He's one of our most experienced educators. Surely some of this could be a misunderstanding?" Victoria's expression didn't waver. "If this were an isolated incident, perhaps. However, I have over 24 written statements from parents detailing similar experiences. It's not a misunderstanding, it's a pattern." Laura leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. "We also have testimonies that highlight Mr. Thompson's favoritism, dismissive remarks, and consistent targeting of students who don't fit his narrow expectations. These aren't just perceptions, they're documented behaviors." Mr. Whitman shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "The school prides itself on creating a supportive environment for all students. If there have been lapses, we certainly want to address them." Victoria seized the moment. A supportive environment means accountability. It means ensuring that no student feels belittled or excluded in the very place that's supposed to nurture their growth. My daughter and many others have been made to feel invisible in Mr. Thompson's classroom. Crestview can and must do better. As she spoke, she noticed a few board members exchanging uneasy glances. They weren't dismissing her outright, but the resistance was palpable. Carter folded his hands and leaned forward. "Miss Taylor, you've made your points well. However, removing a teacher with such a long-standing record is not a decision we can make lightly. We need concrete evidence of misconduct beyond these accounts." Laura responded immediately, her tone unwavering. "You already have concrete evidence in the form of these statements. Additionally, Crestview's own handbook states that all students are entitled to a learning environment free from discrimination or harassment. Mr. Thompson's behavior directly violates that policy." Miss Hanover, who had been silent until now, interjected cautiously. "It's also worth considering how this could impact the school's reputation. A public dismissal of a teacher as prominent as Mr. Thompson could attract unwanted attention." Victoria's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that preserving Crestview's image is more important than protecting its students? No, of course not, Miss Hanover replied quickly, her cheeks flushing. I only mean that this situation needs to be handled delicately. Delicacy should never come at the expense of justice, Victoria shot back. You can't hide behind polished reputations and expect parents like me to stay silent. If Crestview's image suffers, it will be because the school failed to uphold its own values. Mr. Carter raised a hand, signaling for calm. Let's stay focused. Miss Taylor, what specific actions are you asking the board to take? Victoria leaned forward, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. I am asking for Mr. Thompson to be removed from his position immediately. Furthermore, I'm demanding the implementation of mandatory sensitivity training for all faculty and staff, as well as a clear policy for addressing complaints like this in the future. There was a beat of silence as the board absorbed her demands. Mr. Whitman looked particularly uneasy, while Ms. Radcliffe pursed her lips, clearly skeptical. One board member, Dr. Patel, spoke up for the first time. Miss Taylor, your requests are reasonable, and I agree that there should be consequences if these allegations are substantiated. However, I also believe in due process. An investigation should be conducted before any permanent decisions are made. Victoria exchanged a glance with Laura, who gave a slight nod. This wasn't a complete victory, but it was progress. I'm not opposed to an investigation, Victoria said. But I expect it to be thorough and unbiased, and in the meantime, Mr. Thompson should be placed on administrative leave. It's unacceptable for him to continue teaching while this is being resolved. Mr. Carter hesitated, then nodded slowly. That's a fair compromise. The board will vote on placing Mr. Thompson on leave pending the investigation. The vote was taken immediately, and while there was some dissent, most notably from Ms. Radcliffe, the majority agreed. Mr. Thompson would be removed from the classroom while the inquiry was conducted. Victoria exhaled softly, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. This was only a partial victory, but it was a step in the right direction. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Carter stood. We'll keep you updated on the investigation's progress, Miss Taylor. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Victoria stood as well, shaking his hand firmly. Thank you for listening. I'll hold you to your word. Outside the boardroom, Victoria and Laura regrouped with the other parents who had come to support them. Marcus, Maria, and Jasmine looked at her expectantly. What happened? Marcus asked. They've agreed to place him on leave during the investigation, Victoria said. It's not everything we wanted, but it's a start. The parents nodded, their resolve strengthening. They knew the battle wasn't over, but they also knew they had made progress. As Victoria walked out of Crestview that afternoon, her heels clicking against the marble floors, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about ensuring that every student at Crestview felt seen, heard, and valued. The decision to place Mr. Thompson on administrative leave sent ripples through the Crestview community. Some parents whispered their approval in private, while others voiced concern over the school's handling of the matter. For Victoria, it was a small but meaningful victory signal that the board was beginning to take the issue seriously. At home, Elena noticed a shift in her mother's energy. Victoria was as determined as ever, but there was a sense of calm confidence in the way she carried herself. Every evening, Victoria updated Elena on the progress, reminding her that the fight wasn't just about her, but about creating a better environment for everyone. You've been so brave, Elena, Victoria said one night as they sat together in the living room. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't trusted me with your story. Elena smiled faintly. I just hope it actually changes something. It will, Victoria assured her. But change takes time, and we have to keep pushing. True to their word, the school board initiated a formal investigation into the complaints against Mr. Thompson. An external consultant was hired to interview students, parents, and staff, ensuring the process remained unbiased. Victoria, along with the other parents, submitted detailed accounts of the incidents their children had experienced. For Elena, the process was daunting. She was asked to recount her experiences to an investigator, a kind but serious woman named Miss Lambert. Sitting in a small office on campus, Elena fidgeted with her hands as she described the subtle dismissals, the condescending comments, and the humiliating incident during the science experiment. "And how did those moments make you feel?" Miss Lambert asked gently. Elena hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I didn't matter, like no one cared if I was there." Miss Lambert nodded, jotting down notes. "Thank you for sharing, Elena. Your honesty is important, and I promise it will be part of the final report." Meanwhile, Laura continued working behind the scenes, coordinating with parents and ensuring the investigation stayed on track. Victoria maintained regular contact with the school board, pressing them for updates and reminding them that the parents were watching closely. Despite the ongoing investigation, some families resisted the push for accountability. Rachel Carter's mother, Mrs. Carter, was one of the most vocal critics. "I think this whole thing is being blown out of proportion," Mrs. Carter said during a school function. "Mr. Thompson is an excellent teacher. Some parents just can't handle a little discipline." Victoria overheard the comment but chose not to engage. Instead, she channeled her energy into ensuring the school couldn't backpedal on its promises. As the weeks passed, news of the investigation began to spread beyond Crestview. A local journalist, tipped off by one of the parents, reached out to Victoria for an interview. At first, Victoria hesitated. She didn't want to sensationalize the issue or jeopardize the progress they had made. But Laura convinced her otherwise. "This is your chance to shape the narrative," Laura said. "If the school knows the public is watching, they'll be less likely to sweep this under the rug." Victoria agreed, and a few days later, she sat down with the journalist, a sharp and empathetic woman named Claire Jennings. The interview took place in Victoria's home, with Elena's permission to include parts of her story. "I'm not doing this for revenge," Victoria said firmly during the interview. "I'm doing this to ensure that no other child feels the way my daughter did, small, invisible, and unworthy. Crestview claims to stand for excellence and inclusion. It's time they live up to those values." The article, titled "Parent Demands Accountability at Elite School, A Fight for Inclusion," was published the following week. It detailed the allegations against Mr. Thompson, the school's response, and the broader issue of how prestigious institutions handle complaints of bias. The piece gained significant attention, sparking conversations within and beyond the Crestview community. Social media lit up with discussions about the importance of addressing discrimination in schools, with many praising Victoria's courage. Elena's story became a rallying point for parents who had previously felt powerless to speak out. Even those who were initially hesitant to join the fight began to reconsider. The increased scrutiny forced Crestview's administration to accelerate the investigation. A few weeks later, the school board called a special meeting to discuss the findings. Victoria and several other parents were invited to attend, though they were warned the results might not be made public immediately. In the packed boardroom, tensions were high as Mr. Carter, the chairman, summarized the investigation's conclusions. After a thorough review, he began, his tone measured, "The investigation has found that Mr. Thompson's behavior towards certain students was inconsistent with Crestview's standards of professionalism and inclusivity." Victoria felt her breath catch. This was the acknowledgement she had been waiting for. Mr. Carter continued, "Effective immediately, Mr. Thompson's employment with Crestview Academy will be terminated. Additionally, the school will implement mandatory sensitivity training for all faculty and staff and establish a more robust system for addressing complaints." The room was silent for a moment before murmurs of approval began to ripple through the crowd. Some parents exchanged relieved smiles while others sat in quiet reflection. Victoria's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. The fight had been long and difficult, but it had not been in vain. In the days following the announcement, Crestview sent out an official statement to the school community outlining the changes they planned to implement. The letter emphasized the importance of fostering a safe and inclusive environment for all students and acknowledged the bravery of those who had come forward. For Elena, the changes felt like a weight being lifted. Knowing that Mr. Thompson would no longer be in the classroom gave her a sense of relief she hadn't realized she needed. But it wasn't just about Mr. Thompson. The policies being introduced signaled a broader shift that promised to make Crestview a better place for future students. At home, Victoria and Elena shared a quiet moment together, reflecting on how far they had come. "You did it," Elena said softly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You made them listen." Victoria smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "No, we did it. You were brave enough to speak up, and that's what started all of this." Elena hugged her mother tightly, feeling for the first time like she truly belonged. With the investigation concluded and Crestview's administration implementing changes, a sense of resolution settled over the school. However, for Victoria Taylor, the work was far from over. The fight to hold Mr. Thompson accountable was only one part of a larger mission, creating lasting change for every student at Crestview. In the weeks following the announcement, Victoria noticed a shift in the school's atmosphere. Teachers who once seemed indifferent now greeted students with warmer smiles. Parents who had hesitated to support her earlier began to reach out, thanking her for standing up when others were afraid. Even the students seemed to sense the transformation. For Elena, the change was palpable. No longer did she feel like an outsider, walking Crestview's polished hallways. Her classmates, once distant and aloof, were now more welcoming. Some even went out of their way to include her in conversations or invite her to join group projects. One afternoon, during lunch, Rachel Carter, once the epitome of exclusion, approached Elena's table with a hesitant smile. "Hey, Elena," Rachel said, her tone softer than usual. "Do you want to sit with us?" Elena hesitated, glancing at the table of students who were now watching her expectantly. It felt strange, almost surreal, but she nodded. "Sure," she replied, gathering her tray. As she sat down with the group, the conversation flowed more naturally than she'd expected. Though it didn't erase the past, it was a small sign that things were beginning to change. This story of perseverance and resilience highlights the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how intimidating the opposition may seem. Victoria's determination to protect her daughter, Elena, and ensure she was treated with respect is a testament to the strength of parental love and advocacy. By speaking up and uniting with others, Victoria demonstrated that even entrenched systems can be challenged, paving the way for inclusivity and equity. This story teaches us the importance of using our voices, standing together, and leading by example to create meaningful change. If you think this story was inspiring, press 1 in the comments. If you think it was amazing, press 2. We'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever had to stand up for what's right or fight for someone you love? Share your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more empowering stories in the future, and let us know your thoughts about this one. Let's keep the conversation going.